Okay. Hello, class. John Marson is in here. And today is Friday, March 27. This is the lecture that we will be talking about J.S. Bach and looking specifically at the form fugue and Antonio Vivaldi, and we will be looking at the genre concerto and talking about the form associated with the concerto, which is ritornello form. So first of all, everybody did very well on the first exam. All grades are now posted on Blackboard. You should have seen that. You should have received a notification. But if you didn't, you can view your grade at any time. So last class, let's see. We talked about Baroque music in general. Introduction to Baroque music. And we looked at one specific genre, which was the opera. We looked at Henry Purcell's opera Dido and Aeneas and talked about the different components, recitative, aria, and chorus. We listened to a recitative and aria. We will listen to a chorus next class when we talk about the genre oratorio. I have there big on your screen right now, right in the center, oratorio. Today, as I already mentioned, we will be looking at the genre at the top, concerto, solo and concerto grosso, and the ritornello form which goes with that. But we will start with J.S. Bach, and we will look specifically at the genre fugue. So, let's just say a little bit about J.S. Bach. Okay. Here is your Wikipedia article for you to take a look at more closely later. Just going to give some broad information. J.S. Bach, his date 1685 to 1750. By some, he's considered not only one of the greatest composers of all of the Baroque period, but one of the greatest of all times. He is sort of represents the highest quality of Baroque music, of polyphonic music as well. We will be listening to a couple pieces by Bach, just one today, the fugue. So, Bach states, already mentioned, 1685 to 1750. Just a broad overview of where he worked. He had three big positions, and the first one was in Weimar. So he's in and around Germany his entire life. Weimar, 1709 to 1717. He had a court position working for the Duke of Weimar. So I'm mentioning this because I talked a little bit about how do musicians, composers make a living in this era. They are considered craftsmen, unlike we might think of them today as artists or celebrities. They were certainly that as well, but in terms of making a living, you didn't necessarily sell your product to the general public. You had a full-time job, and if you were lucky enough to get a job at one of the aristocratic courts or the churches, you would be set for life. And also, depending where you are, that's going to determine what kind of music you're writing. So Bach is writing a lot of, as you might guess, secular music at this point. He does write some liturgical music as well. And the fugue that we will listen to in a little bit is little earlier. 1705 it was written, right before he had this chord position in Weimar. Curtin, his second chord position, Cothen, 1717 to 1723. Also in this period, probably writing even more in less liturgical music and even more secular music. This is where he writes his concertos that we will talk about later, and many of his popular solo pieces for violin and cello. And his last period in Leipzig, 1723 to 1750, he is the director of music at St. Thomas in Leipzig. So he's not only the director of music at that church, but he oversees the music at other churches. So this is still a popular and common position today. If you're a church musician, you're the church, the music director. So you might be planning the services, playing the organ, or playing the piano, or something else if it's a more contemporary type of church. But was also common back then is not only doing all that and rehearsing the choir, etc., but writing music. That was a big part of the church service. You were writing music for every service, and this is where Bach writes much of his liturgical compositions. So there you have it, very broad overview of J.S. Bach. Now, let's go on and talk a little bit about the fugue. Okay, so the fugue is a popular form in the Baroque period, and it is a type of strict imitative polyphony. Okay, we know what that is. So it's when you have one melody that is played in one voice, and it is imitated by another voice. So in the fugue, this main melody is what's called, right there on your screen, under fugue, the subject. Okay? So remember that. The main melody in a fugue is called the subject. So we hear that by itself, whether it's a piece for solo organ, which we are about to hear, or a piece for voices, multiple instruments. So the main melody is presented by itself. Then it is imitated in another voice. Let's say it starts in the soprano voice, right? You know all these terms now. The highest voice. It's imitated in the alto voice. Second highest in the register, whether we're talking about the human voice or an instrument. We talked about thinking of registers that way. It's imitated. When it's being imitated, that subject in the second voice, the first voice continues with the melody, and we call that the counter subject. It is counter to the subject. Okay? So, and then it's imitated a third time and a fourth time. So, most fugues were in four parts: soprano, alto, tenor, bass. Counter subject plays over the first imitation that we hear of the subject. And that would be what we have in a fugue. That portion of the fugue is often called let's see if this pops up. Oh, I knew that would happen. Okay. All that would be called an exposition. So there it is. This is a fugue, Bach fugue, written in 1705 for solo organ. We're about to hear. There's the exposition. Right at the beginning, highest voice is played, soprano. Next highest is the The fugue, the subject is heard in the alto, followed by the tenor, followed by the bass. Then, as the music moves on, we could call those other sections episodes. This is non-specific fugal material. Then, where it says middle entry, we're hearing throughout, we'll hear fragments of the subject. The melody is being developed, elaborated on. That's a word we will use a lot in the next period. But development just means you have a melody that is presented and you manipulate it as the music progresses. Development. Followed by episode 2. That just means the subject is absent. Middle entry 2, episode 3, middle entry 3, episode 4, etc. So you could see. So once the fugue is presented up at the beginning, the composition becomes more free form, and we will hear elements of the subject coming back and being elaborated on. Okay, so that's all very abstract, all this talking about this. So hopefully now, as we listen to this, it will put it into perspective, and then I'll review all that very briefly again. So, here is our piece. There is the title, Johann Sebastian Bach. He is our composer. This is called Little Fugue in G minor. Little as opposed to big. So by Bach standards, this is a little simple composition. It is definitely not that, as you will hear. It's a very complex piece, but just to give you an idea of how complex some of his music gets. The title is very objective. We have a lot of that in instrumental music. Look at the title of the piece. It's just telling us what it is. It's a fugue, and it's in the key of G minor. It uses the G minor scale. BWV stands for Bach Works 578. In later times, later centuries, musicologists, these would be music historians, try to catalog Bach's music, all the music he wrote, in chronological order. Some of that was easy to do because Bach would date his compositions, but sometimes he didn't. So they would have to investigate, look into what the style is, how it compares with, he seems to be writing this kind of music early on, then he changes his style a little bit. So, according to musicological findings, this is the 578th composition of Bach's, and this is just early on in his career. He still has decades to go. Okay, so let's listen to this piece. Finally, after all that talking, I like this graph because it's showing you the melody. There is the subject by itself, subject meaning the main melody of the piece. Now in the light orange, that's the subject being imitated. The green on top is the counter subject. Two voices. Here comes the purple voice, which will be the subject. Da-dum, ba-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. In the third voice, in the tenor voice. Subject in the fourth voice. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-dum. That's the end of the exposition. This would be episode 1. Highly polyphonic, but no subject. Here's the subject. Hear it? just in a little bit. Bum ba da dum ba da dum ba da dum. Next episode, free of the subject. Here's the subject again. It's been transposed. It's in major key now, not minor. Da-da-dum, ba-da-dum, ba-da-dum. Still the same melody. Episode, no subject. Subject in the lowest voice here, still in major key. Modulating here, moving in and out of different keys. No subject. There's the subject. It is just returned. Episode, free of the subject. Well, a lot of counterpointing, moving in and out of different keys. Then it ends together on a chord. Okay, I hope that made sense. I'm going to play just the beginning of that again, a different version.
I knew he was spending a lot of time at the piano, but
sorry,
I was doubtful he could get that far with a nap.
No control of that. Just so we could see an organist. This is one person playing everything we just heard. Subject. Counter subject in the left hand, the right hand, I'm sorry, subject in the left hand, counter subject in the right hand. Third entry of the subject. Now there's a lot going on. How's he going to play the fourth entry, the bass part of the subject? With his feet. And there it is. That's the exposition. Okay. Hope that made sense. So there it is. We looked at a fugue by J.S. Bach, considered by many to be one of the greatest composers of all time and certainly of the Baroque period. One of the most complex composers of music as well. We talked about a fugue. It is a form of strict imitative polyphony. Subject is the main melody of the fugue. The counter subject is the secondary melody. It is counter to the subject. When imitation begins, the first voice has the counter subject. Episodes would be parts later in the fugue where we are not hearing subject or counter subject. Okay, now those other words, don't worry too specifically about those. Stretto, augmentation, diminution, those are ways of manipulating the subject. Augmentation meaning to play it with longer notes. Diminution to play it in shorter intervals. So those are specifics that we don't have to get into right now. All right. One other thing I want to mention about that piece in Baroque music in general. Think of this when you think of the style or characteristics. There's a unity of form. When you listen to that piece again on your own, notice that it's constantly moving, highly polyphonic, rhythmically, da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. There's always something going on. So the mood of the piece doesn't change. However the piece starts, it continues that way. Okay, let's talk a little bit about a concerto. So a concerto is an instrumental composition, and you could look that up later, do some reading on it. It's an instrumental composition for the orchestra that features a soloist, one of the members in the orchestra. Let's say violin, since that's what we're going to listen to. So a solo concerto would feature a violin player, and the rest of the orchestra would support that soloist. And that's what we're about to hear. Now, a concerto grosso. Grosso simply means more than one. So, that would mean that you would have maybe 2 or 3 soloists that would be featured, and the orchestra would support them. So like a small ensemble or group of instruments within the large ensemble. Hopefully that'll make more sense when we hear our piece in just a moment. A concerto also has 3 movements. There's a word down there, movement. Let's try to think of it in modern terms. So think of it as you have 3 separate songs. Okay, but they're meant to be performed together. So the concerto by Vivaldi that we're about to listen to has 3 movements. The first, the second, and the third. We are going to listen to just the first movement. In a concerto, the first movement is usually fast in tempo, and the form is ritornello form. The second movement is usually slow, and then the third movement would be fast again. So if there's any contrast, it would be between movements, but there tends to be a unity of mood within one movement. Okay, so we will focus just on ritornello form. And you could click on your link there, which I did earlier. What is ritornello form? Here's a simple definition of it. Spaced repetition. Ritornello, meaning something returns. So a concerto in ritornello form, the first movement has the main melody, which we will call A, and then we have a different melody, call that B. Then A comes back, maybe slightly varied or exactly the same. Then we have new music, call that C. Then the main melody comes back, in some part, slightly varied, A. Get the idea? So A, B, A, C, A, D, A, B, etc. So a main melody that keeps returning, ritornello form. That is what we will be listening to by Antonio Vivaldi. I just want to say a couple things about him because I want us to just go get to it and listen to the music. His date, 1678 to 1741. Pretty much a contemporary of Bach's, but a little older. Not by much, but old enough to be his older brother, his big brother, which he wasn't. They weren't related. But Bach took a lot of cues from Vivaldi. Vivaldi was the first to make writing concertos popular. We can't really say that he invented them. It's hard to say who did that. But he was a well-known composer that made this genre, the concerto, popular. And Bach took some of his ideas and went further with them, one might say. So Bach was influenced absolutely by Vivaldi. Let's go to, actually, let me go here first. All these pictures, you don't need to be seeing those. Okay, here we go. All right, so here's the form of the piece we're about to listen to. By Vivaldi, the concerto. Seems like there's so much to say. I'm ready to go on to something else, and then I think, I better tell you about this too. Okay, so what is the title of this piece? There's the composer. You see it up at top. Vivaldi, La Primavera from the Four Seasons, or English translation, Spring. So, Vivaldi writes 4 concertos, each one representing the different seasons, winter, spring, summer, and fall. This one he calls Spring, which has 3 sections, 3 movements, okay? And we will be listening just to the first movement. Now, this is instrumental music. But we might say that this is program music. That term is not in your syllabus because I'm saving it for music in the Romantic period. Program music becomes popular later, but it's happening here, so we have to mention it. What does that mean? This is instrumental music that tries to represent something, a scene, a poem. So this one is clearly representing the season spring, which we are just into at the very beginning of right now. So he's trying to write music that evokes the sounds of spring, okay? So you can see, what does he have written there? The beginning of the piece, the main theme, which I just called A. Tutti means everybody plays. Everybody plays the main melody. Bum 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 ba da dum ba da dum bum bum ba da dum ba da dum ba da 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 dum. Okay, we're going to hear that in just a little bit. That's the main melody played by the full orchestra, announcing spring. Then we have just a smaller section of the ensemble playing. This smaller section, this would be the B section. You see it there? Song of Birds. So here we just have the soloist, the main violin. This is a piece that is a solo concerto, features a violin. And that violin will be in dialogue with another violin, playing what we call trills or ornaments on the violin, trying to evoke the sound of birds chirping. Okay? Then you see at number 2 there, a small letter A, tutti, meaning ritornello. The main melody comes back before we go on to the next section. It would be good if that was listed as C, where it says murmuring streams. Now he tries to write music that sounds like murmuring streams. Then we hear tutti again. Then he writes music that sounds like thunder and lightning. Right here the music gets more minor sounding. Try to point this out. Okay, so all of those sections that are not the ritornello or the tutti, the main theme coming back, all the other sections, the B, C, D, E, etc., they represent the other things that are labeled there. Song of the birds, murmuring streams, thunder and lightning. And it also features the soloist, okay? The main violin. Okay, so a lot of information there. Hopefully it makes more sense as we listen. Let's see if I can find this. I queued everything up. Boy, it's really making us listen to these commercials. Okay, let's get through this. Next video. Here it is. Here's our guy. Okay, this is the concerto, written for solo violin, who is also in the Baroque period the conductor. This guy is the conductor, meaning who directs the rest of the instruments to play together. You'll see him moving his bow to signal the time when to start. Let's just hear a little bit of this, and then I'll stop and point some things out. Main theme, spring. He's conducting. This is the main thing. There's our harpsichord. Basso continuo, the harmonic underpinning. This is the B section. Murmuring, birds chirping, song of the birds. See the guy to his left, to our right, that guy, he's in dialogue. Think of two birds chirping in a tree. They're the only ones playing right now. Full orchestra. Main theme returns. Ritornello. Murmuring streams. Now we're going to return to the main theme again in a different key. He's modulating. It's also in minor. Great. I wanted to pause it there too. I hate to do that in the middle of the piece, but I want us to look at something. Okay, we really haven't talked much about the orchestra, but we're doing that now. I'd like to say something. Okay, this is a standard Baroque orchestra. So what do we have there? We have a lot of string instruments. That's pretty much it. That would be the standard instruments in a Baroque orchestra. So you have a section of what would be called the first violins, and then another group of players, let's say roughly eight first violins, 8 second violins. Then you might have, going from high to low, viola, also held like a violin, but it's a bigger instrument, plays in a lower register. Then we have an even bigger instrument that is, you're still sitting down but holding it between your legs. That would be the cello. And then we have your bass, double bass sometimes called. So the standard Baroque orchestra is a string orchestra with a harpsichord. You see it right there in the center. The harpsichord is playing the chords. So remember, the harpsichord along with the bass line, we call that the basso continuo. All right, that is the chordal foundation of the orchestra. Now, also I want to point out, look at all those empty stands. Okay, so this is a concert in 2006 where they were playing a lot of music on this program. This is a Baroque piece, so they're doing it in the style of the Baroque period. Small orchestra, just string orchestra with harpsichord and the soloist conducting. Then later on in this concert, I'm sure they played pieces from the next period, the classical and the romantic. And all those empty seats you see there, they will be filled in with what will become standard instruments in the orchestra in later periods. Flutes, oboes, clarinets, wind instruments, brass instruments, timpani. Now, all those instruments are still around in the Baroque period, but they're used more sparingly. We will hear them later. We'll hear some of that in the Bach Brandenburg Concerto that we hear next, and also Handel's Oratorio. Okay, so I'm not going to start this piece over again because you can do that on your own. We are in the middle of the composition. It sounds like thunder, lightning. That's the thunder. And then the high stuff, you might think of it as lightning. We're modulating. Thunder and lightning, spring. Now it's raining. Here's the main melody, but it's in the minor key, the minor scale, right? It's not as sunny anymore. There's our first violinist. Remember, he's the featured soloist. That's Itzhak Perlman, by the way, one of the greatest violinists of the last century. Been concertizing since he was about 8 years old. Featured solo. It's the main theme, right? Came back at the end. Terrace dynamics got really soft there. Okay, that's all you need to listen to, but I want to point something else out. That's the end of the first movement, right? That's all we're listening to. Now the second movement. It's slow. Okay, this is still the same concerto. It's slow, it's minor. This is where you get contrast in the Baroque period, from movement to movement. Again, unity of mood is part of the style. So one movement is in one mood, if you will. This movement is slow. I'm going to fast forward ahead. This is the last movement. It's fast and dance-like, okay? So fast, slow, fast. Happy, sad, happy, if you will. You could think of it that way too. Major, minor, major, contrast. Okay. So, let's see. There's the form of our concerto. That's plenty of information. I don't think I want to give you any more for today. So, let's just do a quick recap, okay? Try to tie all that together. What we just listened to was a concerto by Antonio Vivaldi. It was an example of a solo concerto, meaning it features one instrument as the soloist and the orchestra functions as the support. Concerto grosso means more than one soloist. That was not this piece. We will hear that next class. Concertos have more than one movement, but we are listening to just the first. And the first movement in the concerto in this period is always in ritornello form. The main melody keeps coming back. A, B, A, C, A, D, A, B, etc. Whatever the composer chooses to do. The main theme is played by the full orchestra, the tutti. And the B, C, D, whatever, features the soloist, which in this case was a violin. Also in the Baroque period, the soloist, in a solo concerto, as we just saw, conducts. He controls the orchestra. Later periods, there will be one person up there with a baton conducting, not playing an instrument. Okay, and we started today with the fugue. Strict imitative polyphony. The subject is the main melody of the fugue. When that, after it is played, another voice comes in and imitates that, and when that happens, the first voice plays the counter subject. Episodes would be moments in the piece where we do not hear the subject or counter subject being played. Terms, I mentioned terrace dynamic. That means to go from soft to loud drastically, not gradually. That's a characteristic of Baroque music. Basso continuo. This is the chordal underpinning played by the harpsichord and a low string instrument. Think of these instruments as holding down the foundation. They hold down the fort as the other music up above plays in many different polyphonic lines. And that there's your harpsichord down there. So that's what we talked about today. And I think that's all I need to say. So as always, contact me with any questions. I think everybody, based on the first exam, is doing well under these very unusual circumstances. So keep up the good work. And again, please contact me with any questions at all. I will get back to you ASAP and in real time if it's during class time. So see you in the next video, and take care, stay healthy, stay safe.